For 43 years, the victim remained unidentified. In March of 2017, Cleveland Metro Parks detectives began working with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office and the Akron Police Department to investigate a potential lead. The measures include exhuming the victim's body for DNA testing. Now, as a result of present-day scientific methods and technology, the victim is identified as Linda Pagano. Our agency is responsible for the homicide investigation. We're committed to pursuing any leads in this case, and if possible, bringing Linda's killer to justice. Anyone with information is urged to contact Cleveland Metro Parks Ranger Department.
On a cold February day in 1975, 3 teenage boys exploring a wooded area along Ohio's Rocky River made a horrifying discovery. Hidden among the winter brush were scattered human bones. When investigators examined the remains, they found a single gunshot wound to the head. They knew immediately they were investigating a murder. What they didn't know was who the young woman was. Despite months of investigation, no one identified her. No missing person report matched. No family came forward. Within months, she was buried in an unmarked section of a cemetery beneath a simple description: unknown white female bones. For decades, that was all she became, a homicide victim without a name. But the greatest mystery wasn't only who killed her, it was how someone could disappear so completely that even the system designed to identify victims would eventually fail to remember she existed. Nearly 40 years later, a biology student searching through old cemetery records noticed that forgotten burial entry. She wasn't a detective, she wasn't a forensic scientist, she simply couldn't accept that someone had been murdered, buried, and seemingly forgotten. That moment would begin an investigation unlike any before it. A single unanswered question would unite online volunteers, forensic experts, and law enforcement across the country, exposing decades of overlooked records, bureaucratic failures, and one remarkable mistake that had kept a murder victim hidden in plain sight. But before we dive deep into this story, please let us know where you are watching from. And if stories like this interest you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. When investigators discovered unidentified human remains in the 1970s, solving the victim's identity was often as difficult as solving the crime itself. At the time, there were no national databases that allowed police departments across different jurisdictions to compare missing person reports with unidentified remains. Most records existed only on paper, stored in filing cabinets within individual agencies. Communication between departments was often slow, and information that seemed insignificant in one investigation might never reach another. Forensic science also faced significant limitations. DNA profiling had not yet entered criminal investigations, digital record-keeping did not exist, and facial reconstruction technology was still in its early stages. In many cases, investigators relied on dental records, missing person reports, and public recognition to identify victims. If none of those produced answers, a victim could remain unidentified for years, or even decades. As time passed, cold cases became even more difficult to solve. Witnesses moved away or died, physical evidence deteriorated, and investigators retired. Many cases gradually slipped into obscurity, not because they lacked importance, but because the tools needed to solve them simply did not yet exist. Yet the digital age would eventually change that reality. Cases once considered unsolvable could suddenly be viewed through an entirely different lens. The story of the woman once buried as unknown white female bones would become one of the clearest examples of how persistence, modern technology, and decades of overlooked evidence could finally bring a victim's identity back from history. For years, she existed only as a mystery. No one knew her name. No one knew where she had come from, and no one knew who had left her in a wooded area along the Rocky River. But before she became an unidentified homicide victim, she was a teenager with plans for the future, people who cared about her, and an ordinary life that ended without warning. Her name was not yet known to investigators in 1975, but decades later, they would learn that she was Linda Marie Pagano, the youngest of 3 children. Born on April 11, 1957, Linda grew up in Akron, Ohio. Friends and family described her as honest and hardworking. Though naturally shy, She was well liked by those who knew her. She worked part-time at an A&W restaurant, earning money of her own while attending Springfield High School. Standing about 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighing around 100 pounds, Linda had a small frame but an independent streak that became more apparent as she grew older. By the summer of 1974, she was beginning to make more of her own decisions, a change that reportedly created tension at home. According to investigators, her relationship with her stepfather, Byron Claflin, had become increasingly strained. He was known to be a strict disciplinarian, and family members later described frequent disagreements as Linda approached adulthood. Those tensions would become significant in the final hours before she disappeared. On August 31, 1974, Linda joined her boyfriend, Steve Wilson, and several friends for a concert at Cleveland Stadium. The headliners were Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, one of the era's biggest rock bands. More than 80,000 people attended the performance, making it one of the largest events in the region that year. For Linda, it was a night filled with music, friends, and the excitement of being 17 years old. But concerts of that size rarely ended quickly. By the time the final encore concluded, thousands of cars were leaving the stadium. There were friends to drop off and a long drive back to Akron. Linda did not arrive home until approximately 4 o'clock the following morning. Investigators later learned that Byron Claflin had been waiting for her. An argument followed. According to the investigation, Claflin ordered Linda to leave the home and told her not to return. Those were the last documented moments before she vanished. On September 2, 1974, Linda was reported missing. She had no known place to stay and few resources. Unlike today, there were no mobile phones, GPS data, surveillance networks, or social media activity to help investigators reconstruct her movements. Once she disappeared, there were very few clues to follow. As weeks turned into months, hope of finding Linda alive steadily diminished. Then, nearly 6 months later, another discovery would deepen the mystery rather than solve it. On February 15, 1975, 3 teenage boys were exploring Millstream Run Reservation near the Rocky River when they noticed what appeared to be scattered human bones among the winter debris. Police responded and began searching the area. The remains were incomplete. Months of exposure to the elements and animal activity had scattered portions of the skeleton across the woods. Some of the most important forensic evidence was missing altogether, including the jawbone and most of the teeth. Even so, investigators quickly determined that this was not an accidental death. A .24 caliber bullet remained lodged in the left side of the skull. The young woman had been shot in the head. Her death was ruled a homicide. Despite careful examination, the physical evidence offered few answers about who she was. Forensic experts estimated that the victim was a young white woman, roughly 20 years old, but the incomplete skeleton made even that estimate uncertain. Investigators compared dental records, reviewed missing person reports, and pursued every identification method available at the time. One widely publicized comparison even involved Patty Hearst, whose disappearance dominated national headlines during that period. The possibility was quickly ruled out through dental records, but it demonstrated how few promising leads investigators possessed. Nothing matched. No family came forward. No missing person report produced a confirmed identification. The investigation had established how the young woman died, but not who she was. 3 months after the remains were discovered, authorities made a decision that reflected the reality of the investigation. On May 15, 1975, the unidentified victim was buried in Potter's Field at Memorial Gardens Cemetery. Her grave carried no personal inscription. No family gathered at the burial. No friends stood beside the casket. The headstone identified her only by the description investigators could not move beyond. Unknown white female bones. With that, the homicide investigation lost the one piece of evidence that could have transformed the case from an unidentified victim into a missing daughter. Without a name, there were few new leads to pursue. Slowly, the investigation began to fade. For most cold cases, the greatest challenge is finding the victim. In this case, investigators had already done that. What they could not do was connect the unidentified young woman found along the Rocky River to the family that had been searching for her. That contradiction would define the next 4 decades. In 1975, investigators pursued every avenue available to them. They examined the victim's remains, compared dental records, and searched for missing person reports that matched her estimated age and physical characteristics. Without a name, the homicide investigation gradually stalled. The evidence was boxed away, detectives moved on to newer cases, and the unidentified victim became another unsolved file in an era when cold case investigations had few opportunities for renewed momentum. The years quietly accumulated. The late 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. Then came the early 2000s. Advances in forensic science transformed criminal investigations across the country. DNA analysis became a routine investigative tool. National databases were developed to connect missing persons with unidentified remains. Cold cases that had once seemed impossible began to yield answers. Yet this case remained frozen in time. The young woman discovered in 1975 was still buried beneath an anonymous description. Somewhere else in Ohio, her family was still living without knowing what had happened to her. Neither side knew they were connected. Then, in 2014, the investigation took an unexpected turn, not because of new forensic evidence or a police initiative, but because of one ordinary afternoon. Christina Skates, a biology student at Cleveland State University, had developed a passion for genealogy. She enjoyed tracing family histories, studying historical records, and solving puzzles hidden within old documents. While browsing cemetery records, one entry immediately caught her attention. It read simply, "Unknown white female bones." Most people would have continued scrolling. Christina couldn't. She later explained that the entry stayed with her because it seemed fundamentally wrong that someone could be murdered, buried, and remembered only by a description instead of a name. The case also felt personal. Christina had grown up in Strongsville, only about 20 minutes from where the remains had been discovered. This wasn't a distant mystery. It had happened close to home. She began researching everything she could find. Hours were spent in local libraries, scrolling through decades-old newspaper archives and microfilm. She hoped contemporary reporting might reveal details forgotten over time. Instead, she found remarkably little. The discovery of an unidentified homicide victim had received only limited coverage before disappearing almost entirely from public attention. She then contacted police departments throughout the region, including Cleveland Police, Akron Police, and the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office. Again and again, she encountered dead ends. Some agencies no longer had complete records. Others directed her through lengthy public record procedures. Information was scattered across different jurisdictions, preserved unevenly after decades had passed. The investigation seemed trapped behind the same barriers that had allowed it to grow cold in the first place. Then, Christina reached Lieutenant Don Silvis of the Cleveland Metro Parks Police. Unlike many others she had contacted, Silvis recognized her genuine commitment to the case. He agreed to provide copies of the original investigative material, including crime scene photographs, forensic reports, and decades-old case notes. For Christina, the mystery immediately became more tangible. She was no longer reading a cemetery record. She was studying the evidence from an unsolved homicide. Yet even with access to the original files, the investigation reached another standstill. She had exhausted what one person could reasonably accomplish. If the victim was ever going to be identified, more people would have to examine the evidence. So Christina turned to an online community dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Using the username CallMeIce, she shared the cemetery records, investigative documents, forensic information, and everything she had uncovered. The response was immediate. People from across the country began searching newspaper archives, genealogy databases, military records, missing person reports, and historical documents. Others carried the case to web sleuths, where additional volunteers joined the effort. Researchers divided tasks, compared records, and followed leads that no single investigator could have pursued alone. For the first time in decades, the forgotten homicide was receiving sustained attention. Even so, certainty remained out of reach. Potential matches appeared, only to be eliminated. Searches that seemed promising led nowhere. Like the investigators before them, The online community repeatedly encountered hope, followed by disappointment. One person who followed Christina's work from California was Carl Kopelman. A retired accountant, Kopelman had become known for creating forensic facial reconstructions of unidentified victims. His previous work had helped restore names to other long-forgotten Jane Does. But when he examined the photographs from the Strongsville case, he hesitated. The skull had been badly damaged by exposure and animal activity. The jawbone was missing, most of the teeth were gone, and several facial features could only be estimated. For months, Kopelman questioned whether a reliable reconstruction was even possible. Eventually, he decided to try. Using forensic measurements, anatomical references, and digital modeling, he carefully reconstructed what the young woman may have looked like in life. The finished image could never be a perfect likeness. Its purpose was not certainty, its purpose was recognition. For the first time since 1975, the unidentified victim had a face. The reconstruction spread rapidly across Reddit, web sleuths, and other online communities, reaching thousands of people who might recognize her. It felt like the investigation had finally gained the breakthrough it had waited decades to find. But once again, the search appeared to stall. No immediate identification followed. No family came forward. No missing person case was officially connected. After nearly 40 years, investigators, volunteers, and forensic experts were all asking the same question that detectives had asked in 1975. Who was she? The answer, it turned out, had never been hidden by the evidence. It had been hidden by the system itself. That discovery would transform the entire investigation. By 2016, the investigation had gained something it had lacked for decades: momentum. Christina Skates had gathered researchers from across the internet. Carl Kopelman had produced a forensic facial reconstruction that gave the unidentified victim a recognizable face. Yet despite months of work, no one had been able to answer the central question: who was she? Ironically, the breakthrough came while Kopelman was working on an entirely different case. During a phone call with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office, he mentioned the unidentified woman from Strongsville and the reconstruction he had completed. The response surprised him. Officials could find no record of the case in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, commonly known as NamUs. The discovery revealed a critical problem. Although NamUs had become the nation's primary database for comparing unidentified human remains with missing person reports, the Strongsville case had never been entered into the system. Whether because of a clerical mistake or administrative oversight, one of Ohio's oldest unidentified homicide victims had remained invisible to the very database designed to help solve cases like hers. For more than a decade after NamUs became operational, investigators across the country had no opportunity to compare her remains with thousands of missing person reports, because the case simply was not there. Once the mistake was discovered, it was corrected. The forensic information, case details, and Carl Kopelman's facial reconstruction were finally uploaded into the national database. For the first time since 1975, the unidentified victim became visible to investigators nationwide. The results came far more quickly than anyone expected. In December 2016, Sergeant Jeff Smith of the Akron Police Department was conducting routine searches through NamUs when one newly entered case caught his attention. The estimated age seemed familiar. The timeline matched an unsolved disappearance from the Akron area. So did the location. Smith began comparing the unidentified victim with missing person reports from the mid-1970s. One file stood out. It belonged to a 17-year-old girl who had disappeared in September 1974. Her name was Linda Marie Pagano. When Smith compared Linda's missing person photograph with Kopelman's facial reconstruction, the resemblance was striking. The reconstruction alone could not establish an identification, but it suggested investigators were finally looking in the right direction. The next step required scientific confirmation. Investigators reviewed Linda's dental records and compared them with the limited dental evidence recovered from the unidentified remains. Because so much of the jaw and teeth had been lost, the comparison provided encouraging similarities, but not enough certainty to establish identity beyond doubt. DNA testing would be necessary. That meant returning to the cemetery where the unidentified victim had been buried more than 40 years earlier. In October 2017, investigators obtained court authorization to exhume the remains from Memorial Garden Cemetery. Even that proved difficult. Potter's Field contained numerous unmarked graves, and decades of limited record-keeping complicated the search. The first excavation recovered the wrong remains, highlighting once again how easily unidentified victims could disappear within the system. Only after additional surveying and careful excavation were investigators able to locate the correct burial. Samples were then sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification, where scientists performed mitochondrial DNA testing using samples provided by Linda Pagano's surviving siblings. Months later, the results arrived. On June 29, 2018, investigators received the confirmation they had waited decades to hear. The unidentified woman discovered along the Rocky River in 1975 was Linda Marie Pagano. After 44 years, Ohio's forgotten Jane Doe finally had her name back. The official announcement came on July 12, 2018. For investigators, it marked the successful identification of one of Ohio's longest-running Jane Doe cases. For Linda's family, the identification ended 44 years of uncertainty. The questions that had followed them since 1974 finally had an answer, even if the person responsible could no longer be brought before a court. Her brother, Michael Pagano, had spent years wondering what had happened after Linda disappeared in September 1974. According to later accounts, he had even questioned whether the remains discovered in 1975 could belong to his sister, but no identification had been made at the time. Now, scientific evidence had finally provided the answer. Linda had been found. Christina Skates also received the news that the woman whose cemetery record had captured her attention years earlier finally had a name. What began as a simple act of curiosity had become part of an investigation that reunited a family with answers they had waited decades to receive. In January 2019, Linda's remains were cremated and laid to rest beside her mother at Holy Cross Cemetery, replacing the anonymity of an unmarked grave with a burial among family. But while one mystery had finally been solved, another remained. Who had killed Linda Pagano? With her identity established, responsibility for the homicide investigation returned to the Cleveland Metroparks Police. Detectives reviewed the available evidence, but time had changed the case dramatically. The person investigators had long considered a significant figure in Linda's disappearance was her stepfather, Byron Claflin. According to the investigation, he was the last known person to see Linda before she disappeared following the argument at home. However, Claflin died in 1990. Whatever information he possessed about Linda's disappearance died with him. Investigators also sought to learn more about Linda's final hours through her boyfriend, Steve Wilson, who had attended the concert with her. But after more than 4 decades, locating witnesses and reconstructing events had become extraordinarily difficult. The passage of time had become one of the investigation's greatest obstacles. Evidence had deteriorated. Potential witnesses were no longer available. Memories had faded. Although investigators continued examining the case, the available evidence was no longer sufficient to bring criminal charges against anyone. Linda's family finally knew what had happened to her after she disappeared, but the person responsible for her death was never held accountable in court. In the end, justice came in one form, but not in another. Her identity was restored. Her homicide was acknowledged. Yet the question of criminal responsibility remains unresolved.